She called her millionaire boss arrogant. What she didn't know was that he heard every word. One mistake. That's all it took to unravel 4 years of dedication, silence, and carefully guarded emotions. Grace Whitmore was a hardworking secretary. Raising her teenage daughter alone and working late nights at Callahan and Co., she kept her head down, never crossed a line, never spoke out of turn. Until one exhausted evening, her frustration slipped into a voice memo, a message meant only for her best friend. In it, she vented about her cold, demanding boss, and then admitted to feelings she never wanted to confront. But the message didn't go to her friend. It went to the company group chat with 42 employees, including him. If it were you, would you resign, apologize, pretend nothing happened? Or would you follow the thread of an unexpected truth, even if it could cost you everything? This is a story about mistakes that lead to miracles, and the kind of love that asks not for perfection, but for the courage to begin again. If this story touches your heart, don't forget to like, subscribe, and share your thoughts in the comments below. Now, let's begin. She had held her breath for 4 years. That evening, Grace Whitmore finally exhaled, and with it came words she never meant to share with anyone but her best friend. The door to her apartment clicked shut behind her with a soft finality. Grace kicked off her shoes, one landing neatly by the mat, the other thudding awkwardly against the hallway wall. She didn't care. Not tonight. Outside, the sky was darkening into that moody Oregon blue that always felt more like winter than the fall. Rain clung to the windows in soft drizzles. The kind of evening made for quiet, not chaos. But inside Grace, everything was loud, too loud to ignore. Her shoulder bag, weighed down with 4 years' worth of unspoken words, slumped onto the floor as she moved through her small but warm apartment. On the coat rack near the door hung Ella's pink raincoat, a reminder that motherhood didn't allow for breakdowns. But Ella was spending the night at her best friend's house. For once, Grace had the silence all to herself, and it was terrifying. She moved into the kitchen, lit the stove for tea, and leaned both hands against the counter, her reflection ghost-like in the window above the sink. Today had been the final straw. 4 years as James Callahan's executive secretary, 4 years of pristine scheduling, back-to-back meetings, travel itineraries, and press briefings. She knew how he liked his coffee, how he paced when he was thinking, how he hated red ink on printed documents. She knew the man's world, but not the man. Or at least that's what she had convinced herself. Until today, she'd made one small error a client call missed due to a reschedule that hadn't synced in the system. Understandable, human. But James had called her out in front of the full management team, his voice calm but cold, precision-laced disappointment in every word. It wasn't yelling. James never yelled, but it stung more than if he had. Grace had nodded, apologized, and finished the day with her head held high. But now the dignity felt like it was slipping off her shoulders like a soaked coat. She needed someone to hear her, not sympathize, not fix, just listen. Pulling her phone from her bag, Grace scrolled to her best friend Lena's name and opened the voice message app. She didn't bother scripting her thoughts. They came out fast, too fast. Ugh, Lena, if you could have seen him today, you'd understand why I'm losing my mind. James Callahan is the most infuriating man I've ever worked for. Arrogant. Emotionless. He acts like we're all chess pieces in his perfectly controlled little empire. I mean, God forbid anyone make a mistake, even one tiny misstep, and you're treated like a first-year intern. She walked back toward the living room, one hand rubbing her temple. And yet, she sighed, her voice softening. There he is, standing like some stoic, square-jawed monument in a custom suit, speaking in that low, steady voice like nothing in the world rattles him. He doesn't just walk into a room. Lena, he claims it. He walks past my desk, and I swear my pulse changes rhythm. Who lives like that? She dropped onto the couch, eyes staring at the ceiling. I hate that I notice. I hate that when he stands too close, I forget half of what I was going to say. I hate that some part of me, some ridiculous daydreaming part, wonders what that mouth would sound like saying something tender. Something just for me. Her voice cracked into a dry laugh. God, listen to me. Am I seriously this pathetic? He's my boss. He's a millionaire. He's emotionally unavailable and probably still talks to his dead wife in his head. And I'm a woman with student loans, a teenage daughter, and a pantry full of boxed pasta. What am I even doing? The room fell quiet for a moment, the only sound being the whistling kettle she'd forgotten. She stood, picked up the phone again, and added softly, "Anyway, rant over. Needed to get that off my chest. Talk later." Her thumb hovered over the send button. A simple flick. Nothing more. She tapped it, tossed the phone onto the couch, and walked to the kitchen to pour her tea, unaware that her last message had gone not to Lena's private inbox, but to Callahan and Co., internal team chat. Every project manager, every intern, every assistant, all 42 members of the company's main communication thread, including one very specific recipient, James Callahan. By the time Grace returned to her phone, she saw it too late. The tiny check marks under the audio clip, the growing cluster of reactions, laughing faces, shocked emojis, silence. Her chest clenched, her breath caught, her hands began to tremble. The message was already sent, and 42 people had heard her heart, including him. They say your worst mistakes happen in seconds and haunt you for years. Grace Whitmore stood frozen in the middle of her living room, a mug of chamomile tea growing cold in her hand. The screen of her phone glowed faintly in the dark, a battlefield of unread messages and emoji reactions multiplying faster than her breath could steady. Her throat went dry, her stomach twisted. She refreshed the screen once, twice. The voice message was still there, sitting like a landmine in the Callahan & Co. internal team chat just beneath the morning meeting agenda and above a file request from accounting. 42 people. She stared at the number. Someone had already replied with a wide-eyed emoji. Another with a shocked face. A few crueler ones had responded with nothing but laughing reactions. But what truly chilled her wasn't the noise. It was the silence. James Callahan hadn't said a word, not a single line, not an ellipsis, no angry retort, no damage control, nothing. And that, more than anything, terrified her. She dropped the mug onto the coffee table, sloshing tea over a stack of unpaid utility bills, and sank onto the couch, her hand covering her mouth. Her heart beat so fast it was starting to feel like nausea. Her cheeks were hot, her ears ringing. This wasn't just a mistake. This was career suicide. She wanted to scream, to claw the air and take it all back. But there was no rewind button on professional humiliation. Not when your voice message included words like emotionless, arrogant, and wonder what that mouth would sound like saying something tender. A shaky breath escaped her, then another, and then the notification came. Just one message. Just one name. James Callahan, 30, in my office, sharp, that was all. No punctuation, no tone, no clue as to what awaited her in the morning. She read it twice, 3 times, the same 7 words, clinical, efficient, sharp as glass, and it broke her. She pressed her face into her hands and wept. By midnight, Grace was sitting at her dining table in an old sweatshirt and fleece socks, her laptop open, a blank document blinking back at her. She titled it, Formal Resignation, Grace Whitmore. Her fingers hovered above the keys. How do you explain something like this? How do you own it without sounding defensive or worse? Pathetic. She tried to write, to Mr. Callahan, I want to express my sincere apologies for... No, too formal. Dear James, I am deeply sorry for what I said. Too personal. She closed her eyes. The truth sat bitter in her throat. She hadn't just insulted her boss. She had exposed something tender, something human, and that made it worse. Because now it wasn't just professionalism on the line. It was pride. It was trust. It was 4 years of quietly held composure, shattered in 60 seconds of unfiltered confession. She deleted the line, started again, then stopped. She opened her email instead and drafted a message to Lena. "Please call me when you can. I screwed up. Big time." She didn't press send. It was 12:37 a. Lena would already be asleep. And even if she wasn't, what could Grace say that didn't make her sound like she'd lost all sense, because maybe she had? She glanced over at the hallway. Ella's room was dark, the girl still sleeping at her friend's house, blissfully unaware that her mother's world was unraveling one word at a time. Grace shut the laptop with a sigh and rubbed her temples. She paced. She cried again. She tried to eat a piece of toast and couldn't get past the first bite. By 4:00 am. And as she gave up entirely and sat on the couch in a robe, arms wrapped around her knees, watching the rain tap against the windows, her mind wouldn't stop. What if tomorrow he fires me on the spot? What if HR calls me into a meeting and I'm escorted out? What if this ends not just my job, but my reputation? My ability to feed my daughter, keep our apartment, stay afloat? She thought of the whispering that would ripple through the office, the knowing glances, the coworkers who'd smile too politely and say, "Hey, it happens to the best of us," while secretly texting friends about the woman who accidentally thirsted after her boss in a company chat. Her name would be a punchline. Ann James. He would move on, untouched, untouchable, like always. She closed her eyes and tried to picture his face, not the stern expression he wore during meetings, but the unreadable look he'd given her earlier that day when she'd miscommunicated the call time. There had been something in his eyes then, not anger, not even disappointment, something quieter, tired, maybe, but that didn't matter now. Whatever understanding might have existed before, it was gone. By 6:00 a.m. Grace had showered, dressed in her most conservative black slacks and a soft beige blouse. She pulled her hair into a neat bun, applied the bare minimum of makeup. Armor, she thought. This wasn't about vanity. This was about walking into the inevitable with dignity. She placed the folded resignation letter into her handbag. No tears now, just resolve. The sun rose, spilling gold across the tops of the old buildings outside. But Grace felt none of its warmth. She was walking into the longest morning of her life. Grace expected fury. Instead, she got a question that stopped her cold. "Do you really think I'm that arrogant?" She had been sitting in the leather chair across from his desk for less than 30 seconds when he said it. No dramatic pause. No theatrical sigh. Just those 10 words, casual, quiet, and yet sharp enough to cut through every layer of defense she'd built since sunrise. Grace blinked, not entirely certain she'd heard him correctly. James Callahan didn't look angry. He looked tired, maybe even thoughtful. He stood by the window, hands in his pockets, the early morning light casting long shadows behind him. His suit jacket was draped over the back of his chair. His sleeves were rolled up to the forearms, a rare sight, and his expression unreadable. She opened her mouth, then closed it again. Because what did you even say to that? Yes, but not in a bad way. No, I was just venting. Sorry. I fantasized about your mouth. No option felt remotely safe. Instead, she folded her hands in her lap and said the only thing that felt honest, "I didn't mean for you to hear it." James turned then, slowly, and walked around the desk. But instead of sitting in the commanding position behind it, he leaned against the front edge closer to her, level with her, his eyes steady. "I know," he said. "That's what made it so interesting." Grace frowned. "Interesting." He nodded. "Grace, I've spent years in this office, hearing exactly what people think I want to hear. I've been praised, flattered, agreed with, not because people believed in me, but because they needed something from me. Your voice message. It was the first thing I've heard in a long time that felt real, even if it stung a little." She flushed, unsure if that was forgiveness or a quiet warning. "I'm still deeply sorry," she said. "It was unprofessional, inappropriate. I've prepared a resignation letter. Do you believe everything you said? He interrupted gently. She looked up at him. His tone wasn't accusatory. If anything, he seemed curious, wounded, even. She hesitated. Yes, she said finally. In the moment, I did. And some of it, I still do. I think you're hard to read. I think you hold people at a distance. But I also think you're under more pressure than most of us can imagine. And maybe I don't know where the line is between strength and solitude anymore. James didn't respond right away. He walked to the credenza near the window, poured 2 glasses of water, and handed one to her. Then he sat down, not behind the desk, but beside her in the second guest chair, a surprising gesture of equality. I lost my wife 6 years ago, he said quietly. Cancer, fast-moving. We thought we had more time. Grace's heart softened instantly. She knew grief, different shape, different story, but the same cold weight. I'm sorry, she said, her voice low. He nodded once. After she passed, people didn't know what to do with me. I became untouchable, the grieving widower, the CEO with a tragic past. They praised my stoicism, called me disciplined, but really, I just stopped letting anyone in. It was easier that way. He looked at her then, really looked as if trying to read something unspoken in her face. I didn't expect your message, he continued, but it made me realize something. I've built a fortress around myself so well that even honesty had to sneak in by accident. Grace didn't know what to say. The moment felt suspended, like the air between them was heavier than it should be. James set his glass down and leaned forward slightly. There's a gala next Friday, he said, a fundraiser for the city's historical restoration initiative. I've attended alone for the past 5 years, and every time the press paints me as cold, distant, unapproachable. My board keeps pushing for a softer image, a little humanity. He paused. I'd like you to accompany me, not as an employee, as a partner for the evening, someone real, someone I trust. Grace blinked. A gala with James Callahan. After everything, she opened her mouth to protest, to remind him that she was still his secretary, that they'd crossed enough boundaries already, that this was probably a terrible idea. But all that came out was, "You trust me, I do," he said simply. And not in spite of what you said, because of it. Her mind raced through memories of boardroom meetings, budget crises, last-minute travel chaos, all the times she'd been in his orbit, but never once at his side. Now he was inviting her into his world, not as a subordinate, but as something else. She wasn't sure what that something was. Not yet. But it tugged at something in her chest she hadn't felt in a long-time possibility. She looked down at her glass, then back at him. The silence between them was full of everything they weren't saying. Grace blinked. A gala. With the man she just accidentally confessed to desiring, she wasn't sure what to wear to a gala or how to guard her heart while standing beside the man who had just disarmed it. For the rest of that day, Grace moved through her tasks like a woman caught between 2 worlds, one where she was still just an executive secretary holding her breath between deadlines, and another, stranger world where she'd been invited to stand beside James Callahan, not behind him. She hadn't answered his offer yet. She'd nodded, perhaps, smiled, maybe. But as she left his office, her mind had been a swirl of what-ifs and "are you kidding me's?" And now, sitting at her kitchen table with her laptop open to a rental dress website, Grace wasn't sure whether she was shopping out of curiosity or consent. The kettle whistled gently on the stove behind her. Outside, dusk was descending pale gray and gold across the rooftops. Her daughter, Ella, would be home soon. Grace sighed, rubbing her eyes with the heels of her palms. She hadn't even told Lena yet, or Ella. Maybe she was afraid that saying it out loud would make it real, this strange, delicate shift in her carefully organized world. Just as the thought passed, the front door creaked open and closed with the familiar thud of a teenager who didn't yet understand how sound echoed in a quiet home. "Mom?" Ella's voice called. "In the kitchen," Grace replied, already rising. Ella strolled in, backpack slung over one shoulder, cheeks pink from the chill. She plopped an apple from the counter and took a bite before even looking at her mother. Then, squinting, she paused. "You okay?" Grace hesitated, then smiled. "Sort of." Ella chewed slowly. "Sort of's not very convincing." Grace exhaled and gestured to the laptop screen. "Have you ever heard of the city's historical restoration gala?" Ella shrugged. "Isn't that the thing where rich people drink fancy wine and talk about saving old buildings?" "Essentially," Grace said, lips twitching. "Mr. Callahan asked me to go. As his guest." Ella blinked, like a date. "No." The word came out too fast. "Not like that. More like a partner. He wants to seem more approachable to the board and press." Ella raised an eyebrow in that way. Only a teenage girl could equal parts suspicion and amusement. "So, you're going as his emotional support." Human Grace laughed despite herself. "Something like that." "Well, are you going?" Grace looked down at the laptop screen, still paused on a sea green evening gown. "I haven't decided." Ella tilted her head. "Do you want to?" The question hit her harder than expected. She didn't answer right away. Later that night, when Ella was in her room with music drifting under the door, Grace dialed Lena. It didn't take long before Lena's warm voice filled the line. "You're kidding," she said. After Grace explained, "He asked you to go to a black tie gala." After hearing your entire voice memo, Grace groaned. "Please don't remind me." "No, I mean, this is huge. Grace, you've been invisible for so long. And now, the one man who's seen you at your most unfiltered still wants to be around you. He says he trusts me. And do you trust yourself?" Grace paused. That was the question, wasn't it? "I'm afraid I'll read too much into it," she admitted, "that I'll make it more than it is." "Then make a plan," Lena said. "Set boundaries. Treat it like a mission. You're not walking into romance, you're walking into an opportunity to be seen, to stand tall. Maybe that's all this is." Grace nodded. Even though Lena couldn't see it, maybe. The next morning, Grace took the day off. She hadn't used a personal day in nearly 2 years, but now she stood in a small boutique downtown, running her fingers along the silk and velvet of gowns she'd never imagined touching, let alone trying on. She told herself it was for the image professionalism, presentation, corporate optics. But as she stood in front of the mirror in the boutique's soft lighting, something shifted. The dress she chose wasn't flashy. It wasn't tight or revealing. It was simple deep navy, fitted at the waist, soft at the shoulders, elegant without being loud. When she stepped out of the fitting room and caught her reflection, she nearly didn't recognize herself. Her face, usually drawn from long days and little sleep, looked softer. Her eyes held something unfamiliar, not flirtation, not pride, something closer to recognition. It had been a long time since she'd looked in the mirror and seen herself instead of a role she had to play. A long time since she'd felt more like a woman than just a mother, a worker, a fixer of everything. And that realization, quiet, powerful, nearly undid her. She sat down carefully on the bench near the fitting room and took a deep breath. She could do this. Not for James, not for the board, not even for Lena or Ella. For herself. Because maybe this wasn't about being chosen by someone else. Maybe it was about choosing to show up, to be seen, to live. That evening, Grace hung the dress in her closet and smoothed a hand along the fabric. She placed her resignation letter in the drawer, where it would stay. She sent James a simple text. "I'll be there. Tomorrow." She would walk into that ballroom not as a secretary, but as a woman finally seen. All eyes turned when Grace entered the ballroom, but the only gaze she felt was his. The grand chandelier above glittered like a sky full of suspended stars, casting golden light onto the polished floors of the city's historic hotel. Waiters in black vests floated through the room with crystal flutes. Soft jazz poured from a live quartet tucked near the bar, their melodies weaving through conversations and laughter. This wasn't Grace's world, not really. And yet, as she stepped through the arched entryway in her navy dress. Hair swept gently over one shoulder. Something in the room seemed to still just for a moment, as if even the walls took a breath. She didn't see the people. She saw him. James Callahan stood near the center of the room, a glass in hand, tall and composed in a charcoal tuxedo that fit him like it had been made for this very night. His hair was brushed neatly back, but a loose wave fell slightly out of place over his forehead, softening him. Their eyes met across the distance. Not a word was spoken. But something passed between them. Acknowledgement, maybe, or relief, or something quieter than both. He handed his glass to a server and walked toward her, his steps unhurried but certain, like he had waited for this. When he reached her, he didn't speak right away. Instead, he looked at her, truly looked as if taking in every line of the dress, every inch of her face, every breath she drew. "You look..." He paused, and the corners of his mouth lifted just slightly, exactly like someone they'll never forget. Grace felt the warmth rise to her cheeks, but she held his gaze. "And you," she replied gently, "look exactly like someone who finally let his tie breathe." He laughed, soft and genuine, and offered his arm. "Shall we?" She took it, and together, they stepped into the crowd. The introductions came quickly, but never felt forced. James had a way of making her presence feel natural, not as an accessory, but as someone of substance. When he spoke about her, he didn't mention her title. He spoke of her insight, her ideas, her calm under pressure. "This is Grace Whitmore," he told one investor. "She's the reason half our projects stay on track and the other half stay inspired." To a client from Portland, "When I'm too focused on the finish line, she's the one who reminds me what the journey means." Each word chipped away at the wall Grace had carefully built between who she was and who she was allowed to be. And when he said just once, quietly, to a board member's wife, "She's someone I trust more than most," Grace nearly forgot to breathe. He wasn't performing, he was revealing, and that, somehow, was more disarming than charm. They stood near the balcony doors for a moment between conversations, watching the orchestra tune for the next dance. Grace held a glass of sparkling cider. She'd declined champagne not because she didn't want to celebrate, but because she wanted to remember everything clearly. James leaned slightly closer. "You're doing well," he said, voice low enough for only her. She smiled. "I haven't tripped or spilled anything. That's a win." He chuckled. "You belong here, Grace. You always did." She glanced up at him then, letting the truth of the night settle between them. And that's when she saw it, a softness behind his eyes. Not approval, not gratitude, interest, real, quiet, deliberate interest. And in that gaze, she didn't see her boss. She saw a man who was watching her not as an employee, but as a woman. The realization made her heart skip not from fear, but from the sudden tilt of possibility. They weren't just navigating optics anymore. Something else had entered the room with them unspoken, undeniable. He looked away first, ever so slightly, a subtle tell she almost missed. She sipped her cider, suddenly more aware of the way her pulse danced in her wrist. This night wasn't going to go the way she planned. She felt a shift, and she wasn't sure the night would go according to plan anymore. Everyone has a price. Miss Whitmore. But Grace was done being bought by anyone's approval. The ballroom had filled to its fullest by the time David Langford made his entrance as always. 10 minutes after everyone else, ensuring he'd be noticed. He swept in like he owned the room, silver cufflinks glinting, tuxedo perfectly tailored, a slight smirk dancing on his lips. There was an energy about him that was different from James Callahan's steady calm. David was sharper, flashier, hungrier. He was the kind of man who didn't just want to win. He wanted others to know they'd lost. Grace had only seen him once before at a conference 2 years back where he and James had clashed, not in raised voices, but in clipped, strategic remarks that carried more bite than any argument. Since then, David had become CEO of Langford Development, a fast-growing firm that didn't mind cutting corners or stepping on toes. And now, here he was, gliding toward them with the confidence of a man who never doubted his welcome. James stiffened beside her. "David," he said, nodding with polite restraint. "James," David replied, then turned his eyes to Grace, eyes that sparkled with the calculation of someone already crafting the next move. "And this," he said, offering a hand, "must be Grace Whitmore. I've heard quite a bit about you." Grace accepted the handshake, firm and brief, all good things. "I hope—" "Oh, the best," he said smoothly. "Your name comes up often in city planning circles. They say you're the quiet engine behind Callahan and Co., his most graceful pivots." Grace caught the double meaning, but smiled anyway. "I just try to do my part." David's smile widened, but it didn't reach his eyes. "You know," he continued, "we've been expanding. We're acquiring a lot of historical properties in the Southern District. I've been building a new team, fresh energy, innovative vision. It's hard to find people who know how to combine preservation with progress." His tone lowered, like a shared secret. "People like you." James said nothing, though Grace felt the shift in his posture. He wasn't holding her arm, but she felt the subtle tension in the space between them. David went on, "If you're ever looking for a bigger platform, I'd love to have a conversation. Better compensation, creative freedom, a chance to shape the future instead of just typing its agenda." Grace tilted her head. "I wasn't aware I was being stifled." David chuckled. "No offense meant. But let's be honest, some people shine brighter when they're no longer standing in someone else's shadow." The implication hung in the air like cigar smoke. Grace took a slow sip of her cider, then looked David straight in the eye. "I don't doubt your company has exciting opportunities," she said. "Voice, even. But I've never needed to chase a title to feel valued. And I don't stand in anyone's shadow. Mr. Langford, I stand beside people I believe in." David blinked just briefly and the smirk faltered. James's expression didn't change, but Grace could feel the pause in his breath, the quiet stillness that wasn't silence, but something like reverence. David recovered quickly, raising his glass in a mock toast. "Well," he said, "if you ever change your mind, my door's always open." "I appreciate that," Grace replied, "but I've already walked through the right one." With a polite nod, David turned and vanished into the swirl of gala chatter, leaving behind a silence that buzzed with everything unsaid. Grace turned slightly toward James, unsure of what she'd see: gratitude, maybe surprise. But what she saw instead caught her off guard. It wasn't admiration. It wasn't professional approval. It was something quieter, deeper. He looked at her not as a colleague, not as an employee, but as a woman who had just drawn a line in the sand with grace, clarity, and strength. And he saw her, truly saw her. For the first time that night, James Callahan looked at her not just with admiration, but with something deeper. The rooftop was quiet, but their silence spoke louder than the music below. The air had grown colder, the way it does late into a coastal night, not with bitterness, but with a kind of hush. Below them, the gala continued its polished rhythm, a clink of glassware here, a burst of laughter there, the echo of jazz drifting upward like smoke. Grace stood by the railing, arms folded against the breeze. She wasn't cold, not really, but she felt the need to wrap herself in something perhaps not warmth, but steadiness. James had led them up here through a side staircase, bypassing the crowd, the praise, the expectations. Just a few minutes of quiet, he'd said. Now. Here they were, two silhouettes in the dark, suspended between the noise below and the sky above. Neither of them spoke at first, and somehow, that felt honest. Grace was the one to break the silence this time. "I didn't think I'd end the evening on a rooftop with my boss." James turned slightly toward her, hands resting on the iron railing. "I stopped being your boss the moment you spoke to Langford like that," he said, voice soft. Grace glanced at him. "Was that too much?" He shook his head. "No, it was something I wish I could have said to him years ago." The quiet returned, but it wasn't uncomfortable. It was the kind of stillness that allows two people to find their footing without rushing. After a moment, James's voice came, slower this time. You know, I haven't brought anyone up here since she died. Grace didn't need to ask who she was. Mary Ann, he said, confirming the thought. My wife. Grace said nothing, only looked at him with gentle eyes that said, I'm listening. She used to come to these events with me. Always hated the ballroom, said it smelled like money and insecurity. He half smiled, but she loved the stars, the quiet, the way the city faded when you were up high enough. He glanced up. She made everything feel simpler, not easier, just clearer. Grace followed his gaze toward the sky. The stars weren't as bright tonight, but they were there, waiting behind the city's haze. How long has it been? She asked gently. 4 years in December, he said. But grief doesn't run on calendars. Grace nodded. No, it doesn't. She let her hands rest on the railing too, just a few inches from his. My husband left when Ella was 8. One day he said he was going to work late. 2 weeks later, he called from Phoenix to tell me he wasn't coming back. James's brows drew together. I kept the house clean. I paid the bills. I made up bedtime stories that didn't involve broken promises. She continued, and I smiled. A lot. Because everyone around me needed me to be okay. James studied her, his expression unreadable, but his stillness was not distant. It was attention, absorption, maybe even awe. I used to cry in the laundry room, Grace added with a quiet laugh, where the dryer was loud enough to drown it out. A pause. Then James said, barely above a whisper, I used to sit in my car after work and just not go home. Not because I didn't want to be there, but because I was afraid of how quiet it would be without her. Grace turned to him, slowly. Their eyes met, not with intensity, but with the soft weight of two people standing in the echo of what they had endured. And that's when it happened. No grand gesture, no rehearsed moment. Her fingers, resting near his on the iron rail, shifted. Whether by the wind or emotion, they brushed lightly against his. James didn't pull away. Instead, he turned his hand and gently let their fingers meet, not locked, not held tight, but simply touching, a pause, a choice. It was the first time they had touched without obligation, without handshakes or polite greetings. This wasn't professional, it was human. Grace closed her eyes for a moment, not to block anything out, but to take it in. The chill in the air, the buzz of far-off music, the quiet warmth of skin meeting skin, after years of silence. This feels strange, she said softly. James nodded. Strange, but not wrong. She turned toward him slightly. Do you ever wonder if maybe we're not meant to find new chapters? He thought for a moment. I used to think that maybe love was a one-time gift, and once you lost it, all you could do was protect its memory. He looked down at their joined hands. But lately, he added, I'm starting to believe some stories don't end, they just pause. And maybe we get to start again. A different kind of love, built not from innocence, but from understanding. Grace's throat tightened, because in all her quiet years of survival, no one had ever said it quite like that. The wind danced through her hair, carrying salt and distance and a trace of something like hope. I don't know what this is, she whispered, or where it goes. James smiled, small and steady. Neither do I, and that somehow made it feel safe. They didn't kiss. They didn't make promises. They just stood there, in the in-between two people who had worn their grief like second skin, now brushing gently against the possibility of something new. The wind was cold, but Grace felt something warm beginning to rise, and it wasn't from the air. They didn't rush. They walked carefully, slowly, like people who knew what it meant to lose and weren't ready to lose again. After the gala, there were no grand declarations, no hurried dinners, no sudden hand-holding at work. James and Grace returned to their separate lives, but something invisible now connected them, a quiet thread of understanding. woven tighter with every passing day. It began with small things. A text from James the next morning. "Thank you for last night. You were remarkable." A message from Grace 2 days later. "Your team presentation draft page 3 needs a comma. Also, I hope you're sleeping better." Neither tried to define what they were doing. And somehow, that made it easier to keep doing it. They weren't dating, but they weren't strangers anymore either. They became familiar. At work, things remained professional. But outside the office, a new rhythm emerged. On Saturday mornings, they started walking the pier trail, not as a ritual, but because Grace mentioned once that she liked the sound of waves before the city woke up. James had shown up at 6:45 the next weekend, 2 coffees in hand. He didn't say much, just walked beside her. She didn't say much either, but her shoulders dropped half an inch, like something in her had exhaled. And then came the project. It started with a notice in the local paper about a cluster of historic cottages near the old train station, slated for demolition. The city planned to make room for commercial space, but a small community group, led by Lena, Grace's oldest friend, had begun a campaign to preserve and repurpose the homes into transitional housing for women and children. Grace brought it up during lunch in the office kitchen one quiet Wednesday. "I used to walk past those houses when I was pregnant," she said. "They were run down even then, but they had soul. You could feel it." James had nodded. "I have a soft spot for things with good bones." 3 days later, he donated $50,000 under the company's name and offered Grace as the project's internal liaison. That was how they began spending their weekends sanding old doors, reviewing zoning permits, and helping Lena's team with grant applications. They met with contractors and sat in foldable chairs eating deli sandwiches while watching the autumn wind toss golden leaves across cracked sidewalks. Somewhere in all that dust and sunlight, Grace saw something shift in James. Not just his posture or his expressions, but his spirit. He laughed easier. He teased Lena like a younger brother. He let paint stain his expensive shoes and didn't complain once. And one Sunday afternoon, while hauling broken floorboards into a dumpster, he made a joke so dry and unexpected that Grace dropped her clipboard from laughing too hard. "I didn't know you could be funny," she said, wiping tears from her eyes. "I didn't know I was funny," he replied, still smiling. It was the first time she had seen him beam like that, not the tight, polite smile he used in boardrooms, but a full-face lightness that made him look 10 years younger. And for a moment, Grace didn't see the CEO. She saw the man, the widower, the human being learning how to live again. That night, back in her apartment, Grace sat on the couch with Ella, flipping through a magazine she'd picked up from the grocery store. It wasn't her usual reading mostly glossy pages of fundraisers and high society events, but something on the cover had caught her eye. It was the photo. James, in his tuxedo, standing beside her at the gala, his hand just barely resting on her back, her face mid-laugh, caught at the perfect angle. The caption read, "Callahan's Mystery, Guest New Love, or Just a Plus." One Grace's stomach sank. Ella blinked. "That's you." Grace nodded, unsure of how much to say. Her daughter looked at the photo again, then quietly asked, "Why didn't you tell me?" Grace hesitated. "Because I didn't know what to tell." Ella frowned. "Is he your boyfriend?" "No," Grace said gently. "He's someone I'm getting to know. Someone kind." Ella's voice turned quieter. "You never talked about Dad like that." The comment hit deeper than Grace expected. Not because it was cruel, it wasn't, but because it was true, and because it came from a place of aching curiosity. For years, Grace had shielded Ella from her own pain. She had protected her daughter by building walls, never realizing that Ella might need doors instead. "I didn't talk about your dad," Grace said slowly, "because that story was hard. But this—" She trailed off, glancing at the photo again. "This isn't a story yet. It's pages, blank ones." Ella didn't say anything for a long time. Then, after several breaths, she whispered, "I just don't want you to forget about us." Grace pulled her into a soft hug. "Never, honey. You're the first chapter, always. But even as she held her daughter close, a quiet truth stirred inside her, one she hadn't allowed herself to feel until now. It wasn't just her heart she had to protect. It was her daughter's, too. Sometimes love demands a risk, but healing asks for permission. 2 weeks had passed since the photo, since Grace's image, captured beside James at the gala, had appeared in a glossy feature under the headline, "A New Face Beside Callahan." Grace had stared at the magazine for a long time, not because of how she looked, though she barely recognized the poised, radiant woman in the emerald green dress, but because of how James looked at her in that candid shot, as if no one else in the room had existed. It was the kind of look that didn't belong to a CEO and his secretary. It belonged to a man who had started to hope again, and that terrified her. Not because she didn't feel something in return, but because she did. At work, everything returned to its normal rhythm. Or, at least, that's what they tried to pretend. Emails were answered promptly, memos exchanged without a glance too long. But beneath every interaction was something neither of them said aloud. And then came his message, short and sincere. Would you consider having dinner with me, not as colleagues, but as two people who care about each other? Grace had stared at her screen for a full 5 minutes. Her fingers hovered over the keyboard. She didn't type yes, but she didn't type no either. Instead, she closed the laptop, set it aside, and walked to Ella's bedroom. Her daughter was sprawled on the floor, surrounded by colored pencils and a sketch pad. She was drawing something Grace couldn't quite make out, a little house with a big front porch and a tree that bent gently in the wind. Grace sat down beside her. "Sweetheart," she began gently, "can we talk?" Ella didn't look up. "Is this about the photo?" "Yes." A pause. Then Ella said, "I figured you weren't just his assistant." Grace smiled faintly. "You're a smart girl. I Googled him," Ella added. "He's, like, rich. Grace laughed the first time that day. "Yes, he is." Ella finally looked up. "Do you like him?" Grace's throat tightened. She nodded. "I do. But I've been scared to say it out loud. I didn't want to confuse you, or make you feel like I was replacing something we lost." Ella put down her pencil. "You're not replacing Dad. That's not even what this is. It's different." "How do you feel about it?" Grace asked, her voice small. "I feel like you've been taking care of everyone else for so long. You forgot how to let someone take care of you." The words landed in Grace's chest with a weight that was equal parts grief and grace. "I just don't want to make a choice that hurts you." Ella shrugged, wise beyond her 14 years. "I'd rather see you happy and scared than lonely and safe." Grace reached over, pulled her daughter into a hug. "You are my whole world, Ella. You're allowed to have more than one world." "Mom," she whispered. That night, after Ella had gone to bed, Grace stood in the kitchen, still wrapped in her daughter's words. The windows were fogged slightly from the warmth inside. Outside, the night was quiet, the kind of stillness that demanded clarity. She made tea, not because she needed it, but because the ritual soothed her. She watched the steam rise and felt something loosen in her chest. Not everything needed to be decided in fear. Later, she picked up her phone and reread James's message. "Would you consider having dinner with me, not as colleagues, but as two people who care about each other?" Her fingers moved slowly, deliberately. She typed, "Yes." "I'd like that." Then, without sending it, she paused. Because this wasn't just about dinner, it was about letting her heart speak louder than her history. So she erased the message and pressed the call button instead. The line rang once, twice, then his voice, low and familiar. "Grace." She smiled, though he couldn't see it. "Hi, James." "Hi," he replied gently. "I wasn't sure I'd hear from you tonight." "I wasn't sure either," she admitted. "But something happened today. Ella gave me her blessing." A long silence. Then she did. Grace nodded, tears welling. She told me I was allowed to be happy again. On the other end, James exhaled softly. She sounds like someone I'd really like to meet. You will, Grace said, but slowly. On her terms? Of course. Grace walked to the window, the mug warm in her hands. I've spent so long protecting myself, she said, and I think I forgot that healing isn't just about keeping pain out. Sometimes, it's about letting love in. James didn't say anything for a long moment. Then, softly, I'm here. However long it takes. She nodded, more to herself than to him. Then let's begin, she said, carefully, honestly, together. And with that, Grace took her first step, not just toward James, but toward the life she had once thought was lost for good. 6 months later, she replayed the voice memo that had nearly ruined her life and realized it had, in fact, saved it. The wind was soft that morning, brushing gently against the cliffs of the Oregon coastline. Below them, waves whispered against the rocks like old friends retelling stories. Above, a sky of soft gray and gold stretched endlessly quiet, reverent, as if the whole world had paused to watch. Grace stood barefoot on the wooden platform overlooking the sea, her dress a simple ivory that moved like breath. In her hands, a small bouquet of wildflowers, picked that morning from the meadow near their new home. James stood opposite her, in a navy suit with no tie, just an open collar, salt-sprayed hair, and eyes that had held steady through every season of her change. Only a dozen people were there. Ella, of course, standing proudly at Grace's side in a pale blue dress, holding the rings. Lena, with tears already threatening her makeup. A few close friends, James's sister, visiting from Vermont, and 2 co-workers from Callahan and Co., who had witnessed everything from the very beginning. There was no orchestra, no aisle, no grandeur, just quiet love, held like a lantern between 2 people who knew what it meant to lose and chose. Anyway, to begin again. The officiant spoke a few gentle words. Then James took Grace's hands and looked at her like she was still the most unexpected and extraordinary thing that had ever happened to him. His voice was low and steady. Grace, I never thought I'd have this again. Not just marriage, but hope, laughter, a kitchen with mismatched mugs, a voice to come home to. A breeze moved between them like a sigh. I fell in love with you in silence first in the moments you didn't know I was watching. And then I fell again when you weren't trying to impress me. When you were simply you. He paused, thumb brushing her knuckles. So today, I promise not grand things, but everyday things. I promise to listen, to protect your quiet, to love Ella like she's always been mine, to grow old with you slowly, kindly. Grace's breath caught, not from nerves, but from recognition. This was not the man she feared months ago. This was the man who waited for her choice, who stood beside her in grief and healing, who reached for her, not to save her, but to walk with her. When it was her turn to speak, Grace pulled a folded paper from her bouquet. She unfolded it slowly, her voice soft but certain. There was a night, not too long ago, she began, when I thought I had ruined everything. One voice message, one bad day, one honest moment sent to all the wrong people. Soft laughter rippled among the guests, those who knew. I was angry, exhausted, and somewhere in all that, I said things out loud that I never meant to share. But sometimes, she smiled, our most vulnerable words are the ones that open doors we didn't even know were locked. James looked at her gently, his eyes never leaving hers. She continued, that message almost ended my job, my reputation, my sense of safety. But it gave me something else instead. It gave me truth. It showed me that honesty, even the clumsy, messy kind, can lead to grace. She looked over at Ella, who smiled through tears. I don't just say yes to you today, James. I say yes to our imperfect beginnings, to the voice that trembled, to the courage it took to face the fallout. I say yes to love that grows slowly, rooted in something real. She folded the paper again and tucked it back into her bouquet. Then, Lena stepped forward with a small speaker. It's time, she whispered with a knowing smile. Grace blinked. You didn't? Oh, yes. Lena nodded. We absolutely did. And suddenly, through the ocean breeze, a familiar voice crackled through the speaker. Grace's voice, shaky, frustrated, too honest for its own good. That man is going to drive me absolutely insane. I swear. If he rolls his sleeves up one more time, laughter burst from the crowd. James grinned, rubbing a hand over his face. I hate that I notice these things about him. He's arrogant and unfairly attractive. Grace covered her eyes, but she was laughing too from that deep, joyful place that only arrives when you've survived the storm. The message played through every word of vulnerability, tension, confession, and then silence. The sea roared softly below. The sun peeked behind a drifting cloud. Then James spoke again, his voice gentle. That message changed everything. Not because of what you said, but because you let yourself say it. Grace nodded, tears in her eyes. Sometimes, he continued, turning to the guests, love arrives dressed as a mistake. And sometimes, that's exactly what we need to find the truth. The officiant smiled. By the power vested in me, I now pronounce you. But Grace had already pulled James into her arms. Their kiss wasn't the dramatic kind from movies. It was quiet, steady, a seal on a promise made not in perfection, but in presence. The crowd erupted in gentle cheers. Ella tossed wildflower petals into the wind, and as Grace leaned her head against James's shoulder, she whispered, I'll never delete that message. He smiled. Good. I want to hear it every anniversary. They laughed, wrapped in each other, standing at the edge of the sea where everything began not with certainty, but with courage. Sometimes, the words we never meant to share are the ones that change everything. Grace's story reminds us that life doesn't always unfold according to plan, and often, our biggest turning points begin with mistakes, a misplaced message, an honest confession, a moment of vulnerability. They may feel like failures at first, but in truth, they're often invitations to real connection, to healing, and to a life more honest than the one we were trying so hard to control. For those of us who've lived long enough to carry regrets, this story is a quiet reminder. It's never too late to begin again, whether in love, in work, or within ourselves. Courage is not found in perfection. It's found in the willingness to be seen, flaws and all. So, if you've been holding back something real, a truth, an apology, a dream, maybe today is the day to speak it. Because sometimes, the most beautiful chapters begin when we finally stop hiding. Thank you for spending your time with this story. If it touched your heart, even just a little, please consider liking, sharing, and subscribing to our channel. Every click helps us bring more gentle, healing stories to those who need them most. We're grateful to have you here, and we hope to see you again in the next story.